She parked under the shadow of a government warehouse, the badge on her dashboard glinting in the morning sun. DEA Director Taryn Blake wasn't there for ceremony. She came alone, unannounced, because corruption doesn't wait for a press release. For weeks, she'd been quietly investigating reports of missing narcotics from the evidence vault. The whispers were small at first, inventory numbers off by grams, case files modified just enough to slip under review. But last night, a name landed on her desk: Lt. Frank Donovan. A decorated officer with a flawless record and too many closed cases for one man alone. Something didn't add up. She'd seen this before: small-town departments with big ambitions, over-policing, stop-hand search tactics, and manufactured charges. War on drugs, they called it. But for Taryn, who spent her career in federal operations dismantling international cartels, the real threat wasn't across borders. It was right here. Officers planting evidence, manipulating drug charges, framing citizens too poor or too tired to fight back. She didn't expect to be one of them. Not today. Not like this. When the patrol car pulled up behind her Cadillac, she recognized the stance, the performative pause before the flashlight tap on the glass. She lowered her window. Slowly. "Problem, officer." Her voice was calm, precise, controlled. Donovan smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We got a report about a suspicious vehicle. Mind stepping out for a moment?" It was routine, he said. Just a quick check. But as she stood by the hood, she caught the flash of plastic in his left hand, the glint of something being tucked beneath her seat. She didn't speak, not yet. The camera was rolling, and in the language of modern justice, bodycam footage is gospel. When he emerged, holding a small bag, white powder sealed tight, he declared it clearly for the audio. "We have a positive find. Controlled substance, possibly cocaine." He said it like he'd won something, like the paperwork had written itself. But this time, he planted the wrong lie in the wrong car. The truth is, false evidence doesn't just ruin reputations, it destroys lives. Every frame of that footage would soon travel across channels, stitched into news cycles and reaction videos. It would be tagged under police corruption, scandal, and evidence manipulation. But the headline they'd remember was the twist he didn't see coming. She wasn't just another black woman behind the wheel. She was the director of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And someone had just tried to frame her. Now, the question isn't who planted the drugs. The question is how deep the roots go. It was supposed to be a routine check. At least that's how Lt. Frank Donovan framed it on his radio call. Suspicious vehicle, possibly connected to a narcotics complaint. Those words were rehearsed, casually delivered, but each syllable carried weight: legal justification in disguise. His voice, broadcasted through the department channel, masked the real intent behind the stop. To anyone listening, it sounded like protocol. But for DEA Director Taryn Blake, standing quietly by her black Cadillac Escalade, it felt like the beginning of a setup that had been waiting to happen. Taryn wasn't wearing her badge or her sidearm. That morning, she had driven in plain clothes, the way she always did during field audits. She had stepped away from DC to look into irregularities in evidence tracking at the Newford precinct, a mid-sized department in upstate New York. The numbers didn't match. Seized narcotics, especially fentanyl and crack cocaine, were going missing between the arrest and the courtroom. Internal audits were vague. Surveillance logs were incomplete. Someone was manipulating evidence records, and Taryn had followed the breadcrumb trail to this quiet parking lot behind an impound lot. But this time, she wasn't the one doing the watching. As Donovan circled her vehicle, his boots clicking on the concrete, she noticed two other patrol cars roll in behind his, backing in slowly. No sirens, no urgency. They weren't here for backup, they were here for control. 3 officers stepped out. None acknowledged her title. None asked for her identification. Instead, Donovan made it clear, "Please step back, ma'am. For your safety, we're going to conduct a full search." She knew what was happening. This wasn't about a tip or a report. It was about leverage, power, and most of all, optics. He was hoping she'd protest, raise her voice, resist in any way so the bodycam could frame her as uncooperative. But Taryn had been trained differently. She nodded once and watched as Donovan opened the driver's side door, then leaned in unnaturally far beneath the seat. Too far. When he emerged, he held a small plastic bag between two fingers like it was radioactive. Well, looks like we've got a felony possession. There was no fear in her eyes, just the stillness of calculation. She said nothing. As they placed her in handcuffs, the camera was still rolling, and she knew that if she said she was the D director, they would shut it off. They'd claim she threatened them. They'd spin the narrative. So she kept quiet. Because sometimes, silence is the strongest weapon. But what Donovan didn't know was that her car had its own camera silent, front-facing, and it had caught everything. In the department's holding cell, the air was sterile and artificial. Taryn sat alone for nearly 2 hours, no phone call, no paperwork. That alone was a violation. But this wasn't about booking her. This was about intimidation. They were buying time, trying to figure out how much she knew, what she might expose. When the door finally opened, it wasn't an officer who entered, but Chief Haldeman himself. "You made quite the mistake," he said, tone flat. "We're going to need some cooperation." She smiled then, just a flicker. "I think it's you who made the mistake," she said, eyes locked on his. "Because you don't know who I am." That sentence changed everything. Within 10 minutes, her ID had been verified by the Justice Department. Within an hour, a federal oversight team was en route from Albany. But the footage from Donovan's bodycam had already been downloaded. Her car's security system had already uploaded its data, and the timestamp showed it clearly. Donovan placing the bag himself, 3 minutes before his staged discovery. They tried to spin it, claimed it was an internal mix-up, a rogue officer, standard protocol failure. But the problem with corruption is that it rarely happens in isolation. Once you pull one thread, the rest starts to unravel. Internal logs revealed inconsistencies in over 20 cases involving Donovan and his team. Several defendants had pleaded guilty under pressure. Some hadn't even known what they were being charged with. And in each case, the same evidence technician signed off on the drugs without oversight, without authentication. This was no longer a personal attack, it was systemic. Fabricated drug charges, planted narcotics, tampered bodycam evidence. It all pointed to a culture of impunity, one where officers believed they were above scrutiny, protected by a blue wall of silence and technicality. Taryn had seen versions of this in international investigations, cartels hiding behind uniforms, dirty agents, falsifying lab reports, but this was different. This was here, and it was happening in the very systems meant to prevent it. As word spread through the department, a quiet panic set in. Officers whispered in corners. Supervisors triple-checked their case files. But the real shift came when the media caught wind. Police corruption wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a trend, an investigation, a live stream. Taryn didn't do interviews. She let the facts speak, but her footage was leaked, and what it showed changed public perception overnight. Not because she was the D director, but because she was calm, professional, respectful and still. They tried to frame her. That's what resonated. It wasn't about rank or title. It was about how easily someone with nothing to hide could still be buried under false charges if the system wanted them to be. Her silence had become a symbol. Her arrest became a flashpoint. And when she finally stood before the press, days later, with Donovan now suspended and facing internal review, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't call for revenge. She asked one question: how many people didn't have cameras? It was that moment, quiet and direct, that broke through the noise. The public didn't just want justice. They wanted transparency. They wanted oversight. And they wanted someone to finally say what everyone already suspected: that in some departments, the war on drugs had become a war on truth. The footage had already traveled further than anyone inside the New York Police Department could control. By the time Internal Affairs scheduled their first meeting, it was trending on multiple platforms under hashtags like #DeframeJob. #bodycamtruth, and #whoplanted it. National news anchors repeated the scene on loop, a uniformed officer reaching beneath the seat of an unmarked car. Then, emerging triumphantly with a small plastic bag unaware, the woman he was framing led one of the most powerful federal agencies in the country. But the cameras didn't capture what came next. Not the politics, not the fear, not the quiet reckoning that spread through the system like a slow-building fire. Inside the federal building downtown, the mood was different. Cold, clinical, strategic. Taryn Blake stood in front of a whiteboard that now detailed 23 flagged cases, all connected by 3 names: LT, Frank Donovan, evidence clerk, Michael Brill, and Officer Kendra Lowe. Each had signed off on arrests involving low-level possession. All of them centered in the same district. The same neighborhoods, the same demographics, and every single case had one glaring similarity: the accused were Black or Latino. And all the evidence was found during traffic stops or house calls without clear probable cause. But the numbers only told part of the story. The rest came from victims' young men still serving time. Mothers who'd lost custody of their children over felony charges they couldn't fight. And public defenders who had quietly suspected misconduct, but lacked the resources to prove it. What made this moment different wasn't just that someone got caught. It was who they tried to frame. It was the fact that this time, there were multiple video sources, timestamps, and federal witnesses. This time, the system had been forced to look inward. Donovan, when first questioned, doubled down, claimed he had acted on a tip, insisted that Taryn had looked suspicious, and that his discovery was purely coincidental. But the timeline didn't hold. Surveillance showed him entering the department evidence locker at 6:42 a.m. 15 minutes before leaving on patrol. Logs showed he had checked out one unsealed narcotics envelope marked for destruction but never catalogued. There was no tip, no emergency call, just a plan, executed poorly. Against the wrong woman. When confronted with the video from Taryn's car, the silent dashcam capturing him planting the substance, Donovan changed tactics. He called it a test. Said he suspected she was internal affairs and was trying to expose corruption himself. It was a story crafted for damage control, not truth. But even that narrative collapsed when records revealed he had altered bodycam footage in 2 prior arrests, removing key segments before submitting the files to prosecutors. Those charges had led to convictions. That's when the conversation shifted from individual misconduct to institutional rot. Investigators from the Department of Justice, now fully involved, found that the precinct lacked basic safeguards. Evidence wasn't logged with chain of custody, no dual authentic. Officers could sign out bags of narcotics with nothing more than a handwritten note. Bodycam uploads were managed internally, with no third-party audit. It was a system designed for discretion, not accountability. The local district attorney, once a vocal supporter of the Newford PD, called an emergency press conference. For the first time, she publicly acknowledged what had long been whispered behind closed doors. We have reason to believe that criminal misconduct was not only tolerated, but facilitated by procedural failure within our law enforcement structure. Effective immediately, my office is pausing all prosecutions tied to the flagged cases pending independent review. It was a moment of rare political humility, but also desperation. The pressure was growing. Protests formed outside the precinct within hours. Not just activists, but families, former defendants, teachers, clergy, people who had lived for years with suspicion but now had evidence. They didn't chant, they asked questions. How many more? Who knew? What will change? And above all, why did it take the DEA director getting framed for anyone to listen? Inside the Justice Department, Taryn found herself at the center of something she didn't ask for: a national reckoning. She had always believed in institutional reform, but she knew this case couldn't be solved with a press release or training seminar. It needed transparency, real consequences, a shift in how departments report, review, and respond to evidence tampering, false arrest, and police misconduct. And most of all, it needed protection for those brave enough to speak up. So she did something most directors wouldn't. She went public. Not with rage, with data, with clarity. In an exclusive interview, she explained the audit findings, the failure points, the human cost. She spoke not as a victim, but as a leader. And when asked what scared her most, she answered plainly that, if this could happen to me with credentials, clearance, and surveillance, what's happening to the people who have none of that? That clip was shared over 20 million times in the first week. Schools played it in criminal justice classes. Advocacy groups used it in policy proposals. Civil rights attorneys cited it in federal filings. Because the core message wasn't about one woman being framed, it was about a culture where drug charges can be manufactured, where bodycam evidence can be manipulated, and where people can be buried in paperwork so quietly the world forgets to ask questions. As the internal investigation expanded, more officers came forward. Some anonymously, some with lawyers. A young patrolman admitted he'd been pressured to meet arrest quotas by targeting high-risk zones, a phrase everyone understood to mean black neighborhoods. A sergeant confessed to disposing of dashcam footage that contradicted arrest reports. A rookie cop described the unwritten rule of silence. If you questioned the system, you became the next target. What started as a scandal was now a case study. Law schools analyzed it. Civilian review boards across the country used it to argue for independent auditing. States revisited their bodycam retention policies. One senator cited it during a judiciary hearing, saying, "This isn't about bad apples, it's about a broken orchard with no fences." And through it all, Taryn remained steady. Not seeking revenge, but reform. She met with governors, testified before Congress, and in a moment that captured national attention, she visited a halfway house where two young men had been recently released after their convictions were overturned. Both arrested by Donovan years earlier. They didn't ask for an apology. They asked if she thought anything would change. And she told them the truth, only if we don't look away this time. That sentence, soft but weighty, became the rallying cry of a growing movement. Don't look away. Printed on signs, spoken at rallies, posted in hashtags. It reminded people that justice isn't just about catching the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent from systems that pretend to be blind, but often look the other way. And for the first time in years, Taryn Blake wasn't behind a desk in Washington or buried in field reports. She was standing at the center of a national conversation. Not because she wanted to, but because someone tried to silence her and failed. The public wanted a villain, and for a while, Lt. Frank Donovan wore that title like a badge of shame. Headlines named him as the man who tried to plant false drug charges on a high-ranking federal official. Clips of him handling the plastic bag circulated endlessly. Commentators dissected his body language, his tone, the way he smirked on camera. But beneath the media storm, Taryn Blake saw something more dangerous: complacency. Because blaming one officer was easy. What came next wasn't. As the DOJ audit expanded beyond Newford, new districts were flagged. Anomalies in evidence logs. Cases reopened due to missing bodycam footage. Dozens of internal reviews were launched across 3 states. What began as a localized scandal now resembled a pattern-structured silence. Encouraged by outdated oversight and convenient loopholes, Taryn recognized it instantly. Not just misconduct, but culture. A system that didn't need overt conspiracy to fail. It just needed indifference. Behind closed doors, things were shifting. In one meeting, a retired federal prosecutor admitted, "We always suspected some reports were too clean, too consistent, but no one wanted to challenge success." That phrase stayed with her. Too consistent, because Donovan's reports were airtight. Each arrest lined up with evidence, each suspect matched a profile. But it was the pattern that gave him away. Racial profiling, quota-based stops, and repeat charges against the same demographic in the same zip code in a rare closed session hearing. Taryn was shown a sealed file from a federal informant, former narcotics officer from a neighboring state, who confessed that his department kept a toolbox in the trunk of their patrol SUV. Inside were confiscated narcotics never logged, fake IDs, and unused burner phones. They called it insurance, in case an arrest needed support, or in case a narrative had to be shaped. That term echoed across the table. Shaping the narrative, officers didn't see it as planting evidence. They saw it as completing a story the system already wanted to hear. One email thread, uncovered through a FOIA request, revealed officers joking about a suspect who forgot to bring his drugs, so we helped him out. Another listed incentives tied to drug arrests: extra overtime, departmental recognition, easier promotion track. In one department, officers were told to focus on numbers, not names. The higher the volume of drug-related arrests, the better the funding. Taryn had spent years dismantling cartels that operated on fear and silence. But here, in these precincts, the silence wasn't fear-based. It was systemic routine. Officers weren't hiding in shadows. They were filling out forms, checking boxes, being rewarded. This wasn't just one man with a bad plan. This was a factory with no safety checks. Public opinion began to fracture. Some held tight to the belief that Donovan was a lone bad actor. Others saw the expanding pattern as undeniable proof of institutional failure. Law enforcement unions pushed back, citing attacks on morale. But former officers, those who had resigned quietly over the years, began to speak. One described the invisible wall he hit every time he raised concerns. Another shared how IA reports were rewritten before reaching City Hall. Accountability, one said, only happens when someone important gets hurt, not before. In one town, a woman revealed that her son had been arrested twice in 2 years, both times for substances she swore he didn't carry. He was 17 when he went in. Now 20, he had never made it back to school. He had a backpack, not a bag of pills, she said. Her voice cracked. But they told him to take the deal. Said it was easier than fighting. That interview, played over national radio, sparked waves of similar calls. Parents, teachers, probation officers, everyone had a story, and now they had a platform. Taryn was no longer just a director. She was a symbol of what could have been lost credentials, dignity, truth if not for a silent camera. And while she remained calm publicly, she was unflinching behind the scenes. She proposed federal legislation requiring third-party data storage for all bodycam evidence. Immediate suspension pending review for any officer involved in evidence tampering, and mandatory quarterly audits on narcotics inventories in local departments. She called it the Chain of Truth Initiative. But with progress came resistance. A coalition of sheriffs lobbied against it, citing budget concerns. One congressman claimed it would cripple local policing. In a televised debate, he said, "You can't expect officers to do their jobs with one hand tied behind their back." Taryn, sitting opposite him, didn't blink. "We're not tying hands, we're keeping them clean." Her words became headlines. Then came the twist no one saw coming. An anonymous source released an internal memo showing that Donovan's unit had been under quiet investigation 2 years before the incident with early warnings. Submitted by a rookie officer who had documented inconsistencies in 2 arrests. The officer had requested whistleblower protections but was reassigned within weeks. The memo was buried. No action was taken. The news broke like thunder. This wasn't negligence, it was suppression. Someone high enough had chosen to protect the unit's image instead of investigating its methods. And now that choice was public. The state attorney general launched a special task force. Grand jury subpoenas were issued to several supervisors. Investigators were looking not just at Donovan, but the administrators who knew, the officials who looked away, and the city managers who signed off on settlements without admitting fault. And through all of it, Taryn kept moving. Not chasing headlines, but chasing reform. She didn't seek applause, she asked better questions. What happens to the people still locked up because no one recorded their side? How many body cams were turned off too early? How many reports were edited before review? And the one that stayed with her most, who's protecting those who speak up? Because the story wasn't just about corruption, it was about courage, not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that wears a badge, not for power, but for truth. The kind that refuses to let silence write the ending. It took 6 months for the first convictions to be overturned. Quietly, in courtrooms with no press and no applause. Judges dismissed charges that had stood for years, charges that had kept fathers from their kids. Young men from college, and entire families trapped in cycles of probation, debt, and distrust. Each name cleared was a silent victory, but it also came with a question that couldn't be ignored. Why did it take so long? Why did the system only move when the wrong person was targeted? Frank Donovan eventually pled guilty not to planting evidence, but to misconduct in office and tampering with police records. It was a deal. Lesser charges, shorter sentence. Taryn Blake never publicly reacted to the verdict. But inside, it left a mark. Not because justice hadn't been served, but because it revealed how carefully justice could be negotiated when those responsible wore a badge. Accountability had come but filtered, reduced, softened. In his final interview before sentencing, Donovan looked into the camera, not with pride or denial, but with something more haunting, recognition. "We thought we were helping," he said, "doing what it took to keep the streets clean." And there it was. The lie they told themselves. The myth that the ends justified the means, that drug enforcement was a war, and in war, there are acceptable casualties. But justice isn't war. It's process, it's balance. It's designed to protect the innocent as fiercely as it prosecutes the guilty. Somewhere along the way, too many forgot that. And Taryn's story reminded the country that even the most well-trained, most credentialed, most respected, can still become a target if the system is left unchecked. She stood again in front of cameras, months later, not to defend herself, but to unveil reforms. Independent bodycam auditors, evidence chain tracking using blockchain systems, national false evidence review panels. She didn't just want reaction. She demanded reconstruction. But more powerful than policy was her final message. Delivered not from a podium, but from a community center in one of the neighborhoods most affected. She stood beside mothers who had buried sons, beside young men who had lived with a felony record longer than they'd lived free, and she told the truth. "This didn't happen because I'm special, it happened because I had evidence, a camera, a title. But most people don't. And if justice only works for people with power, then it isn't justice, it's privilege." The room was silent. Then one voice from the back asked, "So what now?" Taryn didn't pause. "Now we listen better. We build better. And we make sure that silence never speaks louder than truth again." And in that moment, it was clear. The story wasn't about a frame job. It was about a reckoning. One that asked every officer, every leader, every citizen to decide, are we brave enough to fix what we've allowed to break? Because the future of justice isn't written in laws. It's written in choices. They said Frank Donovan never spoke at sentencing. But in the silence of his cell, he spoke often to himself. He replayed the bodycam footage, not as defense, but as confession. Frame by frame, he watched the moment he reached beneath that seat. His hands shook not from fear, but from the weight of realizing he was no longer protecting anything real. He had become the thing he once claimed to fight. A man who believed his badge gave him permission to rewrite the truth. He thought about the faces. The ones he arrested, the ones he never looked at twice. They blurred together in reports, in statistics, in shift briefings. But now, they had names, stories, mothers, dreams. He used to tell himself that the system was flawed, but necessary. Now he knew it wasn't flawed. It was built exactly how it was meant to be. And he had upheld it, one planted lie at a time. "I thought I was serving justice," he whispered one night, "but I was serving fear." It wasn't redemption. It wasn't enough, but it was honest. And sometimes, that's where rebuilding begins. So now, we ask you not just to listen, but to act. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you uncomfortable, sit with it. If you saw yourself in it, the silenced, or the silent, remember. The system doesn't change unless we demand better. Better cameras, better oversight, better training. But more than anything, Better courage the kind that speaks up, not just when it's safe, but when it matters most. Because injustice isn't just what we commit, it's also what we allow. Don't look away. Don't scroll past. You have power. Use it. Let truth be louder than silence.